I'm reading today from Dr. Edward Edinger's The Aion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. And I'm reading from Chapter 5, which refers to paragraphs 43 to 67 of Aion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self by C.G. Jung. The Self. We have now worked our way down the psyche, through the ego, the shadow, and the anima animus to arrive at the self. Defining the term self is difficult. The word ego is also problematic, but it is nothing when compared with the term self as it is used psychologically. Self does refer to an empirical reality, but its exact nature is impossible for the ego to delineate. All that can be done is to approach it from various angles and get little pieces of its meaning. One definition of the self is that it is the totality of the psyche which manifests itself as a unitary entity. It can also be said that the self is the psyche in its wholeness, which includes both the ego and the totality of the unconscious. A third formulation is that the self is both the center and circumference of the psyche, corresponding to the old definition of God as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. There is a logical problem in all of this, because when the self is defined as the totality of the psyche, the totality includes the ego. How can the ego, a mere part of the whole, stand separate and speak of the totality as though it were something separate from itself? This paradox is built into the human psyche and into the phenomenon of consciousness. It is as though the ego, as the son, takes over some of the qualities of the self as the father and presumes to be a separate entity even while it is still part of the whole. Empirically, the psyche has two centers, the ego, the subjective center, and the self, the objective center. Considerable psychological development is necessary before a person experiences that, although it is easy enough to grasp the idea that there are two centers. Jung, a psychological genius, had a clear awareness of the two centers in his youth, as a passage from his autobiography demonstrates. Jung is talking here about personalities number 1 and number 2. Quote, Number 2 regarded number 1 as a difficult and thankless moral task, a lesson that had to be got through somehow, complicated by a variety of faults such as spells of laziness, despondency, depression, inept enthusiasm for ideas and things that nobody valued, liable to imaginary friendships, limited, prejudiced, stupid in mathematics, neither an honest Christian nor anything else. Number 2 had no definable character at all. He was a vita perfecta, a completed life, born, living, dead, everything in one, a total vision of life. Though pitilessly clear about himself, he was unable to express himself through the dense, dark medium of number 1, though he longed to do so. When number 2 predominated, number 1 was contained and obliterated in him, just as conversely, number 1 regarded number 2 as a region of inner darkness. Number 2 felt that any conceivable expression of himself would be like a stone thrown over the edge of the world, dropping soundlessly into infinite night. But in him, number 2, light reigned, as in the spacious halls of a royal palace, whose high casements open upon a landscape flooded with sunlight. Here were meaning and historical continuity, in strong contrast to the incoherent fortuitousness of number one's life, which had no real points of contact with its environment. Number two, on the other hand, felt himself in secret accord with the Middle Ages, as personified by Faust, with the legacy of a past which had obviously stirred Goethe to the depths. For Goethe, too, therefore, and this was my great consolation, number two was reality. End quote. Footnote, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, pages 86 and following. Jung's youthful experience is astonishing. He is talking about an episode at the age of 12 or 13. Of course, he is describing this occurrence from the greatly enlarged consciousness of old age, and it is probably safe to say that he could not have formulated it in this way in his youth, but the experience was there, and he then became able to formulate it retrospectively. This is relevant to this chapter on the self, because what Jung has to say about the self here predisposes a very well-developed ego in the second half of life. That kind of ego is not encountered very often. Footnote, for a fuller discussion of the relation between the ego and the self at different stages of development, see my Ego and Archetype, Individuation and the Religious Function of the Psyche, pages 5 and following and 62 and following. That's referring to Dr. Edinger's book. Figure 6, page 36, shows how the relation between the ego and the self develops in the course of unfolding consciousness. It refers to 4 different stages of ego development, 4 ways the ego might relate to the self. In the first stage, the ego is still contained in the original unconscious self. It has not been born yet, so to speak. In the second stage, it starts to peep out nevertheless, in spite of the fact that it has some separate existence. The ego's center still remains in the self, so there is still a predominant state of ego-self identity, which means that there can be no experience such as that which Jung describes as personality number 1 and number 2. Ego and self would be felt as identical. In the third stage, the center of the ego has emerged from its containment in the self, and the ego is now in a position to experience itself as a separate center. The connection between the ego and the self becomes conscious. What I call the ego-self axis becomes a connecting link of which one is aware. Of course, there would be no awareness of such a link until there is awareness of a duality rather than a unity. The fourth stage is a hypothetical ideal, an imaginary state with no residual ego-self identity at all. To the extent that the ego is identified with the self, which is the state of the vast majority of humanity, unconscious assumptions prevail that the ego carries the qualities of the self, that the ego is immortal, that it is the center of the world, and that its desires have the imperative of deity. This is not thought consciously, of course. Consciously, one can be quite civilized and apparently humble, yet still have quite different underlying unconscious assumptions, which come into view under special circumstances. The caption to Figure 6 reads, Stages of the ego-self relationship. The diagram shows relationships between ego and self, the 2 centers of the personality, as the ego becomes more differentiated from the self in the process of psychological development. And this is the Figure 6. Figure 7 This is figure 7. Let me read the caption to figure 7 first. Figure 7, the psychic life cycle. The typical cycle in a person's early development is shown, starting at the top with the original state of ego self-identity. The subsequent typical events lead to the return to the original state, but with some increase in consciousness. The cycle may be interrupted at 2 points, A and B. Figure 7 presents a schema for the way development proceeds from stages 1 to 4. This figure represents a sequence of events which occur when one acts out the unconscious ego self-identity. As long as the identity is not acted upon, nothing happens. But if it is expressed in action, it meets a rebuff from reality. That rebuff causes a wounding and reflection, then a metanoia or change of mind, which heals the wound and reconnects the ego with the self, returning it to its state of ego self-identity until the next episode. Each time that circle is made, a little bit of ego self-identity is dissolved, so to speak, and a little more consciousness is born. One other point preparatory to Jung's discussion of the self concerns the breakdown of religious projections. Illustrated in figures 8a and b, pages 38 and 39, footnote, these are also diagrammed and discussed on pages 65 and following of My Ego and Archetype. As long as one is contained in a particular set of religious beliefs, the dogma carries the projection of the self. The self is equivalent to the inner God image, and in such a situation, the self, or the God image, is found in a metaphysical projection. This serves a certain protective function. While the projection remains intact, there will not be any direct encounter between ego and self. If that projection breaks down, various things can happen. One can lose one's connection to the self and fall into a state of alienation and despair because life becomes meaningless. Or one can fall into an inflation, which very often leads to alienation, its opposite. Or the self may be reprojected, for instance, onto a political system, a common phenomenon. The meanings that used to be carried by religious contents are now often carried by political movements. A fourth possibility, following the breakdown of the religious projection, is that individuation can occur, in which case the ego has a living encounter with the self as a psychological entity. Jung's discussion of the experience of the self in this chapter pertains to individuals who have lost their religious projection. It will not have any meaning for people whose religious projection is still intact. Here's diagrams 8a and 8b, which I will leave on the video. The caption to 8a reads, States of Religious Projection. The diagram pictures a community of individuals in whom the self is projected onto a religious system. Figure 8b, the diagram indicates possible outcomes for different individuals when the religious projection of the self breaks down. You shouldn't blame yourself if you find yourself falling asleep during these lectures. The material is extremely complicated and requires multiple listenings. As you see, I self-hypnotize when I'm reading these, and so I'm going to have to break this part and so I'm going to have to break this part of Dr. Edinger's book into two parts because I just can't go on today. I'll try to work on the second part later. I have been reading from Edward Edinger's The Aion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. I've been reading from Edward Edinger's The Aion Lectures, Exploring the Self in C.G. Jung's Aion. The Aion Lectures are published by Inner City Books and edited by Deborah A. Wesley.